On the second day of January 2009, the warm, rhythmic hum of the Bahamian surf outside the old Bahama Bay Hotel was violently severed by a sound that no amount of wealth, fame, or earthly devotion could mute. Inside a luxury vacation suite, a frantic, desperate struggle for breath was unfolding. Jet Travolta, just 16 years old, lay on the bathroom floor, his body gripped by a massive, catastrophic seizure that caused him to strike his head against the porcelain fixture. For hours inside that closed room, the world's most recognizable symbol of effortless grace, movement, and control was brought to his absolute knees. The man who had spent 30 years convincing the global public that he could glide over any obstacle, that he could dance through the rain and fly above the storm, was suddenly trapped in a terrifying, motionless vacuum. He was a helpless father, executing desperate, frantic chest compressions on his own boy, screaming into the void of a tropical morning, while the machinery of his untouchable life completely seized up. In those agonizing, sweating minutes before the sirens arrived, decades of building a flawless, Teflon-coated Hollywood persona did not just crack. They shattered into microscopic pieces. For nearly half a century, the name John Travolta was synonymous with a very specific kind of American invincibility. He was the kinetic blueprint of cool, the load-bearing pillar of Hollywood charisma, who possessed a smile that felt like a warm embrace and a stride that could stop traffic on a Brooklyn pavement. He was the man who had survived the volatile, cannibalistic nature of show business not once, but twice, engineering comebacks so spectacular they felt less like career pivots and more like divine resurrections. But on that Black Friday in the Bahamas, the illusion of complete autonomy evaporated. The world watched in a state of suspended shock as the smooth, carefully manicured facade of the screen icon was replaced by the raw, hollowed-out visage of a grief-stricken father forced to defend his family's private medical secrets, his unorthodox spiritual devotion, and his own profound guilt under the blinding, merciless glare of the international tabloid press. The ultimate symbol of flight was suddenly, brutally grounded. How does a man who spent his entire existence running from the shadow of mortality, using the rhythm of the dance floor and the cockpit of multi-million-dollar commercial airliners to outrun his ghosts, survive when the universe forces him into total, suffocating stillness? What kind of internal architecture does it take to maintain a public smile when your private world has repeatedly become a graveyard of those you cherished most? The whispers had already begun to circulate through the industry, pointing toward the invisible fractures in his armored personal life, his absolute dependence on a controversial faith, and a deep-seated, terrifying addiction to external validation that had dictated his choices since adolescence. But to truly understand how the armor failed on that tragic morning, to comprehend the psychological cost of being John Travolta, we cannot merely look at the wreckage left on the bathroom floor in the Bahamas. Before we can answer any of that, we must go back to the very beginning, to a cold, working-class landscape where the rhythm was first discovered, and where a young boy first learned that the only way to escape the darkness was to never stop moving. Long before the velvet ropes of Hollywood or the deafening roars of global adulation, the internal architecture of John Travolta was forged in a landscape completely detached from glamour. This was Englewood, New Jersey, in the frost-bitten winters of the late 1950s and 1960s. It was an inner-ring suburb, hanging in the heavy, industrial shadow of New York City, not the manicured enclave of modern wealth, but a gritty, working-class landscape of post-war anxiety, exhaust fumes, and clanging steel. The youngest of 6 children born into a tight-knit, predominantly Irish Catholic neighborhood, his domestic world was anchored by 2 starkly opposing forces. His father, Salvatore, was a rugged second-generation Italian-American, a former semi-professional football player who ground out a living as a partner in a local tire exchange. He was a man of concrete realities, grease and rubber. But the true gravity of the household belonged to his mother, Helen Burke Travolta. Helen was a formidable force of nature, a high school drama teacher and former radio singer whose own dreams of center stage glory had been cut short by the rigid societal constraints of her generation. Denied her own spotlight, Helen transformed the family's modest home into a living, breathing domestic theater. And in her youngest son, John, she recognized her ultimate masterpiece. Inside the safety of the Travolta home, life was a continuous, hyper-stylized rehearsal. Helen did not read standard fairy tales to her children at bedtime. She performed classic plays aloud, dynamically shifting her voice to embody every character. The children were constantly challenged to engage in elaborate improvisational role-playing games, instructed to assume entirely different identities on a whim. In this intensely insulated environment, John was treated not merely as a child, but as an anointed prodigy. He was showered with an overwhelming, intoxicating brand of maternal affection that linked his personal value entirely to his ability to entertain. But this domestic warmth created a dangerous, psychological hypersensitivity. The moment the young boy stepped across the threshold of his family's home and into the asphalt yard of Dwight Morrow High School, the protective stage lighting vanished, replaced by the cold, unforgiving gray of reality. Outside, the very qualities that made him a king in his mother's living room rendered him a bizarre, hyper-vulnerable target. In the aggressive, rigid social hierarchy of working-class New Jersey, a sensitive, dream-addled boy who preferred Broadway cast recordings to sports was met with immediate, merciless alienation. He was an academic misfit, drifting through classes in a state of perpetual, hyper-focused detachment, completely unable to connect with his peers. The isolation was profound, settling into his bones as a deep-seated childhood trauma, a terrifying, constant realization that his authentic self was something the world desired to mock, suppress, and exclude. To survive this hostile landscape, the young Travolta began to construct a masterful piece of psychological armor. He discovered that if he could completely control his physical presentation, if he could mirror the swagger of the local street toughs, channel his deep anxieties into the precise, rhythmic movements of dance, and shield his bleeding vulnerability behind an infectious, unthreatening smile, he could disarm the bullies before they could strike. Performance ceased to be a mere hobby or an artistic pursuit. It became a literal survival mechanism, a bulletproof vest woven from charm, mimicry, and rhythm, engineered to mask a desperate, clawing terror of rejection. He learned to become a mirror, reflecting exactly what people wanted to see, so they would never look close enough to see the broken child underneath. This armor carried a devastating internal price tag. By dedicating every waking hour to perfecting an idealized, hyper-confident physical persona designed for public consumption, he began to sever the connection to his own internal reality. The boundary between the performer and the human being started to blur until the applause of an audience became the only oxygen his ego could breathe. He was trapped in a perpetual loop of needing to be witnessed, convinced that stillness or silence would mean total erasure. The stage was no longer a place of creative expression, but a fortress built to keep the darkness of isolation at bay. As he crossed into his 16th year, the claustrophobia of his hometown became entirely unbearable, pushing him toward a radical, desperate break from the conventional path. He dropped out of high school as a junior, turning his back on the traditional safety nets of family and community to plunge headfirst into the volatile wilderness of professional show business. He was running toward the bright lights of Manhattan and Los Angeles, convinced that if he could just make the entire world fall in love with his creation, the internal ghost of the lonely New Jersey boy would finally be silenced. But the entertainment industry was waiting for him with a brutal lesson, ready to prove that the highest peaks of sudden success are often built directly over the deepest, most agonizing abysses of human heartbreak. To leave Englewood at 16 was to step off a cliff into an absolute void. But for John Travolta, the alternative was slow psychological suffocation. He traded the security of the family nest for a nomadic, grueling existence in the minor leagues of American entertainment. Dragging a suitcase through summer stock theater in New Jersey, cold-calling casting directors in Manhattan, and surviving on cheap food while pitching himself for television commercials. His currency was a hyper-animated energy, an unpolished combination of working-class swagger and intense vulnerability that eventually caught the eye of Hollywood executives. By 1975, he had captured the cultural zeitgeist as Vinnie Barbarino, the dim-witted but undeniably charismatic high school heartthrob in the hit sitcom Welcome Back, Kotter. Almost overnight, his face was plastered across the bedroom walls of millions of teenagers. The armor he had built in his childhood was working perfectly. He had engineered a massive public obsession to insulate himself from his deep internal isolation. Yet, precisely at the moment his external world exploded into a symphony of adulation, his private reality was ambushed by a devastating, humbling crisis that tore his psychological defenses to ribbons. The turning point arrived in 1976 on the set of a high-profile ABC television film titled The Boy in the Plastic Bubble. Travolta was cast as the lead, portraying a fragile teenager trapped inside a sterile, hermetically sealed environment due to a compromised immune system. Cast as his mother in the production was Diana Hyland, an accomplished, intensely magnetic actress who was 18 years his senior. Despite the significant age gap and the conventional taboos of the era, the emotional chemistry between them was instantaneous, profound, and deeply disruptive. For Travolta, Hyland was not merely a romantic partner. She was an intellectual anchor, an experienced artistic mentor, and a stabilizing force who offered the exact blend of unconditional maternal warmth and professional validation his psyche desperately craved. They fell into a whirlwind, all-consuming romance, openly planning a future, a home, and a marriage together. For the first time in his life, Travolta felt safe enough to lower his guard, believing he had found an oasis of genuine intimacy where he could exist without the exhausting burden of performing. But the security was a cruel illusion. Unbeknownst to the public, Hyland had been privately battling breast cancer, having undergone a mastectomy the year prior. By the Christmas season of 1976, while Travolta was navigating the dizzying, surreal height of his teenage popularity, Hyland's health collapsed as the disease aggressively metastasized throughout her body. The trajectory was terrifyingly swift. Travolta found himself caught in an agonizing, surreal duality, forced to flash his signature, heartthrob smile for frantic fans and television cameras by day, while spending his nights keeping a bedside vigil over a dying woman. On March 27, 1977, the crisis reached its ultimate, crushing finality. Diana Hyland passed away at the age of 41, literally drawing her final breaths while cradled in the arms of a 23-year-old Travolta. The loss was a brutal, existential shock to his system. The universe had delivered a savage proof that all his newfound fame, his accumulating wealth, and his flawless physical grace were utterly impotent when confronting the cold reality of mortality. The psychological impact of this first profound grief completely destabilized his identity. He was a young man grieving a monumental private loss, while trapped under the suffocating, relentless microscope of global celebrity. The sheer velocity of his fame offered no room for authentic mourning. The Hollywood machinery demanded he remain a smiling, uncomplicated commodity. Desperate to manage the overwhelming, paralyzing weight of his grief and the terrifying chaos of his environment, Travolta sought refuge in the rigid, structured doctrines of the Church of Scientology, an organization he had first encountered a couple of years earlier, but now embraced as an absolute existential lifeline. He needed an ideological fortress to explain the senselessness of his heartbreak, a systematic technology to master his roiling internal panic, and an external authority to tell him how to survive the loss of his anchor. He was a broken young man, hiding inside a rapidly expanding empire, privately haunted by a ghost, while the rest of the world was demanding he become an immortal god of rhythm. Just days after burying his first love, he was forced to step onto a film set in New York, channeling his raw, weeping internal trauma into a project that would either completely break him or launch him into the stratosphere of cinematic legend. Stepping directly out of the shadow of a fresh grave, John Travolta entered the humid, volatile summer of 1977 by plunging into a project that would cement his image as the kinetic god of a generation. This was Saturday Night Fever. On the grime-encrusted pavements of Brooklyn, he did not just play Tony Manero. He exuded a raw, muscular vulnerability that perfectly captured the desperate, suffocating desire to escape the limitations of a working-class existence. The physical mechanics of his performance were breathtaking. The iconic strut down the pavement, the meticulous grooming of his hair, the intense, smoldering eye contact. It was a masterful display of swagger, masking a deep, aching fear of insignificance. Every line of his body, wrapped in that legendary white polyester suit, was wound like a tight spring. He took the internal isolation of his own New Jersey childhood, the unresolved academic shame, and the fresh, bleeding trauma of Diana Hyland's death, and channeled them into the precise, explosive geometry of the dance floor. It was the only place where Tony Manero, and perhaps John Travolta, felt truly safe, completely witnessed, and utterly untouchable. The cultural impact was an absolute earthquake. Saturday Night Fever shattered box office records and earned Travolta an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor at the astonishingly young age of 24, catapulting him directly into the highest echelon of the global A-list. Before the world could even process this new blueprint of masculine charisma, he pivoted immediately into Grease in 1978. As Danny Zuko, he traded the gritty, cocaine-fueled desperation of the disco era for a hyper-stylized, slicked-back fantasy of 1950s youth. The contrast was deliberate and highly effective. He held the screen with an unthreatening, almost cartoonish charm, a synthesis of Marlon Brando's rebel posture and Elvis Presley's rhythm, softened by a goofy, magnetic smile that made him accessible to children, teenagers, and parents alike. He had become the load-bearing pillar of late 70s popular culture, an industrial-strength icon who dictated fashion, music, and social behavior across the entire globe. The world fell completely and helplessly in love with this cinematic armor. From London to Tokyo, audiences mistook the flawless rhythm and the blinding grin for a man who had conquered the universe, completely unaware of the profound exhaustion pulling at his heels behind the scenes. The applause became a deafening white noise roar that insulated him, but it was a fragile piece. Just as he reached the absolute summit of his superstardom, the universe struck another devastating blow. In 1978, his mother, Helen, the primary architect of his ambitions, the woman who had baptized him in the waters of performance, succumbed to cancer. Suddenly, he was the most famous young man on Earth, Yet he was utterly orphaned from the two women who had truly known the human being beneath the superstar. The global idol was left stranded at the peak of his kingdom, surrounded by millions of screaming fans, but completely alone in his dressing room. He had used fame to outrun his grief, but Hollywood is a cannibalistic machine that demands a constant, relentless evolution of its gods. When the music of the late 70s began to fade, and the glitter of the disco ball finally shattered into the harsh light of a new decade, the silence that followed would reveal a terrifying 10-year descent into the cultural wilderness, a humbling exile that would test the absolute limits of his survival armor. True mastery of an art form occurs when a performer stops executing movements and begins to bleed through their work. For John Travolta, the camera was never a mere recording device. It was an emotional excavation tool, a clinical instrument he used to reach deep into the dark soil, where childhood isolation, unvoiced grief, and the ghosts of his private life had been buried alive. He did not merely memorize dialogue or block out steps. Instead, he systematically stripped away his survival armor on set, letting his real-world wounds pulse openly underneath the skin of his characters. The first profound demonstration of this excavation occurred in the very performance that built his kingdom, Tony Manero in Saturday Night Fever. On the surface, the film was marketed as a glittering, pulse-pounding celebration of the disco explosion. But underneath the neon glare and the thumping bass line, Travolta constructed a deeply unsettling psychological portrait of a young man trapped in a claustrophobic cage. He reached into the raw memories of his own adolescent alienation in Englewood, resurrecting the exact, suffocating sensation of being judged, dismissed, and isolated by a rigid, uncomprehending environment. When Tony stands in front of his bedroom mirror, meticulously adjusting his hair and his clothing under the hostile, hypercritical gaze of his family, Travolta is not playing a part. He is reenacting the precise domestic theater of his youth, exposing the exhausting mechanics of a boy who realized very early that he must become physically perfect to be deemed worthy of love. The dance floor ceases to be a platform for exhibition. It becomes a desperate battlefield. Every explosive leap and precise, aggressive gesture is an act of defiance, a frantic attempt to scream, "Witness me, because outside this circle of light, I do not exist." 4 years later, in 1981, this artistic extraction turned from psychological exposure into a visceral, bloodletting exorcism in Brian De Palma's neo-noir masterpiece, Blowout. Travolta portrayed Jack Terry, a deeply disillusioned movie sound technician who accidentally records a political assassination and is subsequently pulled into a lethal vortex of corruption. To fully comprehend the devastating weight of this performance, one must look directly through the lens of Travolta's private history. He was only 4 years removed from holding the dying, cancer-ravaged body of his first love, Diana Hyland, in his arms, a catastrophic event that had left his psyche permanently scarred by the agonizing trauma of helplessness. De Palma structured the climax of the film as a direct, merciless ambush of that specific memory. Jack Terry sprints frantically through a roaring, indifferent 4th of July celebration in Philadelphia, desperately listening through his headphones as the woman he has tried to protect is systematically murdered by a political fixer. When Jack finally reaches her, it is too late. Her life has already slipped through his fingers. Travolta pulls her limp body into his arms and unleashes a primal, shattering scream of absolute despair. A howl so jagged, hollow, and genuinely horrifying that it remains one of the most devastating sounds ever captured on celluloid. It was not the simulated grief of a Hollywood leading man. It was the raw, unedited echo of a 23-year-old boy screaming into the void of a hospital room in 1977. mourning a loss he could neither prevent nor escape. But the ultimate, most sophisticated act of emotional archaeology occurred in 1994, when Quentin Tarantino plucked a washed-up, heavily dismissed Travolta out of a decade-long professional exile to play Vincent Vega in Pulp Fiction. The world expected a nostalgic, tongue-in-cheek recycling of his old dance steps. Instead, Travolta delivered something infinitely more profound and deeply subverted. He arrived on screen carrying the literal weight of his own decade-long obsolescence, his body heavier, his movements noticeably decelerated, his signature blue eyes clouded by an unmistakable, weary exhaustion. He channeled the numbing, protective detachment he had used to survive years of Hollywood mockery into the heavy-lidded, heroin-addicted psychology of a hitman. The ultimate subversion manifested during the legendary dance sequence at Jackrabbit Slim's. When Vincent Vega steps onto the floor opposite Uma Thurman to perform the twist, the electrifying, razor-sharp precision of Tony Manero is entirely gone. In its place is a slow, deliberate, almost hypnotic economy of movement. He glides across the floor with a heavy, fluid grace, his fingers tracing a lazy line across his eyes, his torso swaying with the relaxed confidence of a man who has looked directly into the abyss of absolute failure and chosen to simply dance right past it. It was a spectacular, metatextual victory. Travolta took the very weapon that had defined his youth, his body, and used it to signal that he had evolved past the desperate need to impress. He was no longer a boy frantically begging for applause. He was a scarred, resilient survivor who understood that the only way to beat the machine was to move to a completely different rhythm. This second kingdom of immense wealth, critical adulation, and renewed power felt entirely absolute, offering a golden, fortified sanctuary where he could once again fly high above the vulnerabilities of the mortal world. But inside the thick, gilded walls of his newly restored empire, quiet, invisible fractures were already beginning to spread across the foundation, preparing a trap that no amount of cinematic genius could dismantle. By the mid-1990s, the resurrection of John Travolta was absolute, and with it came the construction of a staggering, fortified empire. He had transitioned from a washed-up relic of the disco era into an elder statesman of Hollywood power, commanding $20 million paychecks and unparalleled creative autonomy. To secure this new kingdom against the vulnerabilities of the ordinary world, he engineered an existence defined by hyper-control and grand industrial-scale luxury. He married actress Kelly Preston in 1991, establishing a seemingly bulletproof Hollywood union that radiated stability, beauty, and mutual devotion. Together, they became the premier global ambassadors for the Church of Scientology, utilizing their immense celebrity leverage to shield the controversial organization from public scrutiny. But the most revealing manifestation of his internal state was his obsession with aviation. Travolta did not merely collect planes. He acquired commercial-grade, multi-million-dollar Qantas, Boeing 707, and Gulfstream jets, constructing a massive bespoke estate in Ocala, Florida, where a literal commercial runway stretched directly to his front door. It was the ultimate physical expression of his profound terror of stillness, a magnificent mechanical armor that allowed him to literally escape the gravity of the earth whenever the pressure of reality became too heavy. If he was in the air, navigating the predictable instrument panels of a cockpit, the chaotic vulnerabilities of human life could not touch him. Yet, behind the blinding glare of this mid-career majesty, subtle, erratic fractures were quietly spreading across the foundation of his empire. The first deep structural crack manifested in the year 2000 with his disastrous passion project, Battlefield Earth. Driven by an intense, unyielding hubris and a desire to validate the science fiction doctrines of Scientology's founder, L. Ron Hubbard, Travolta poured his own capital and immense industry capital into a film that became a legendary, critical, and commercial catastrophe. It was a glaring exposure of his fatal flaw, an insatiable, lifelong dependency on external validation paired with a profound insulation from reality. Surrounded by handlers, spiritual auditors, and sycophants who reinforced his invincibility, he had lost the ability to distinguish between artistic intuition and ideological echo chambers. As the new millennium progressed, the whispers behind the scenes grew deafening. The glossy, picture-perfect portrait of his domestic life was increasingly ambushed by aggressive legal challenges, highly publicized whisper campaigns, and deep tabloid scrutiny regarding his private conduct, and the extreme pressures required to maintain a rigidly traditional, heterosexual public persona. For decades, the industry had tacitly participated in the protection of his image, but as the cultural landscape shifted, the walls of his fortress began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a high-stakes cage. He was a man locked in a furious, exhausting sprint, constantly flying, constantly performing, constantly smiling, desperately trying to outrun a gathering storm of personal reckoning. Even as he celebrated his 72nd year, shocking onlookers at the Cannes Film Festival with a radically smooth, dramatically transformed countenance that sparked global speculation about his inability to accept the natural decay of time, it became clear that his battle against gravity was a lifelong sentence. He had spent over 30 years believing that if he flew high enough, if he maintained the rhythm, and if he remained completely faithful to the rigid technologies of his belief system, he could permanently insulate his loved ones from the cold hands of fate. But the universe does not respect the fortresses of Hollywood royalty, and the heavy debt of his lifelong flight was about to be collected in the most brutal winter of his existence. The luxury fortress crumbled to dust in a single, devastating winter. On that terrifying Bahamian morning in 2009, when the life of his 16-year-old son, Jet, slipped away on a bathroom floor, the absolute finality of human vulnerability crashed through John Travolta's carefully orchestrated universe. The aftermath was a visceral, slow-motion nightmare. The man who had spent a lifetime escaping into the sky was suddenly pinned to the earth under the merciless, blinding glare of a global media apparatus. The industry that had long worshipped his kinetic grace watched in suspended shock as his most sacred private agonies were dissected in the public square. Tabloid headlines relentlessly targeted the family's medical secrets, weaponized his allegiance to a highly scrutinized faith, and plunged his personal life into an unprecedented, standard-shattering legal and media circus. For the first time in his career, the applause ceased entirely, replaced by a deafening hollow silence as Hollywood's elite grew quiet and the protective machinery of his stardom completely ground to a halt. Yet, the universe was not finished demanding its toll from the aging icon. Over a decade later, the cruel, poetic nature of tragedy struck his fortified sanctuary once more. In 2020, his wife, Kelly Preston, the anchor of his restored empire, and his partner through 30 years of private storms, succumbed to breast cancer after a quiet, fiercely protected 2-year battle. The loss was a devastating, agonizing echo of the exact same disease that had stolen his first love, Diana Hyland, 43 years earlier. Stripped of his wife, haunted by the memory of his firstborn son, and carrying the exhaustion of a half-century spent under the public microscope, Travolta entered a profound, self-imposed exile. He quietly retreated from the aggressive, validation-seeking engine of modern Hollywood A-list stardom, grounding his massive commercial jets, selling off pieces of his sprawling aviation empire, and retreating into the quiet, still expanses of Florida to raise his remaining children, Ella Bleu and Benjamin, as a single father. But the final act of an elite survivor is never written in defeat. The culmination of this extraordinary human odyssey manifested in a breathtaking, deeply emotional full-circle moment on the global stage. At 72 years old, Travolta emerged from his prolonged melancholic stillness to walk the red carpet at the Cannes Film Festival. Looking strikingly transformed, his signature gaze framed by a sharp beret, tinted glasses, and a neatly groomed beard, he arrived not as a nostalgic relic begging for the past, but as a man who had radically reset his relationship with existence. Standing proudly alongside his 26-year-old daughter, Ella Bleu, who has inherited both his performance bloodline and his resilient grace, Travolta presented his feature directorial debut, Propeller One-Way Night Coach. The project, an intimate adaptation of a story he had written decades earlier out of his pure, untainted love for flight, was not designed for box office dominance. It was a profound piece of creative legacy, featuring a real presentation explicitly dedicated to the memory of Kelly and Jet. When the festival leadership took the stage to surprise him with an honorary Palme d'Or for lifetime achievement, the standing ovation from the international cinematic community did not just celebrate his legendary rhythm. It acknowledged the immense, staggering weight of a man who had survived the absolute highest peaks and the most hollow abysses of the human condition. Deeply moved, his eyes glistening under the theater lights, Travolta accepted the honor not as an armored superstar, but as an exposed, radically authentic human being. The armor he had spent his childhood building in Englewood, the physical perfection he had demanded of himself to outrun his grief, had finally been discarded. By choosing to step out of the cockpit to halt the exhausting chase for external validation, and to channel his profound losses directly into his children and his raw artistic legacy, he achieved his ultimate, most permanent victory. John Travolta had finally conquered his lifelong terror of stillness, discovering that when the music stops and the applause fades away, the true dance of survival is found in the quiet, unyielding courage to stand exactly where you are.